I think the idea of the victim is constantly being debated in sort of in Jewish fiction and in Jewish life generally. I mean, I'm kind of remembering that Roth and Bellow, and actually one of the interesting things about Roth is that evidently he admired Bellow greatly, who was probably about 10 years older, 15, maybe one generation slightly a kind of older than him. And there's a very interesting essay Roth writes where he actually attacks Bellow, this is kind of in mid-career, because he thinks that he's gone back to a rhetoric of the victim. And so he loves kind of Augie March in Bellow's novel The Adventures of Augie March, precisely because he is kind of who's not the kind of the very introverted, worried, guilt-ridden Jewishness. And then says, but with his kind of later characters, with Herzog and Samler, it's as if he's going back to this model, it's almost a Gentile-imposed model of Jewishness as neurosis. And he then has this very interesting sentence where he says, we must stop acting as if we are victims. It is not always 1933, is his phrase. And that sort of certainly chimes, I think, with now, where there is certainly one strand of Jewish discourse, and I think especially maybe in American Jewishness, which is worried that it is still 1933. And I think Israel is where all this gets kind of cathected on, basically, is whether there is still an incipient kind of tragedy about to happen, and therefore whether the question of loyalty has to come in, because is there still a tragedy about to happen, and in that case you should be much more loyal than if actually now the situation is calmer.
Well, I think that's, I think that at each point, and you see it in England, at each point at which the sharp end is encountered, there is an ingathering of opinion, and there is a sense expressed by Jewish commentators in the English media that you have to fall on one side or other of the divide, and you know, in a sense, that's what's happened, if you like. The existence of the State of Israel has become for that kind of, you know, potential and historical memory of victimhood, and that must be reiterated. And the idea, I mean, I'm not sure you had the right line on who it's attributed to, but the line, you know, I may be a self-hating Jew, but I don't hate myself because I'm Jewish.
This is Woody Allen.
It's a Woody Allen line. It gets trotted out again in Curb Your Enthusiasm, of course, outside, is provoked. And of course there's the terrible scene where he employs the string ensemble to play the Siegfried idyll to his wife on the occasion of her birthday, which also provokes some remarks like that. But I think that, you know, that perhaps is the test case. Is it possible to argue that you're a self-hating Jew, but that you don't hate yourself because you're Jewish? Because for me, that would be the axiom in the moment of 1933.
Yeah.
In other words, to be able to present a character that has a victimology, and was a Jewish character, but the Jewishness is irrelevant to that victimology. And I wonder whether that's possible. I mean, it's interesting what you say about Bellow, because of course, while he does have appetitive, non-victim Jewish characters, when he looks for the ultimate appetitive non-victim character, it's Henderson,
who is not Jewish.
Who is not Jewish. Yeah. So, you know, in other words, I'm not so sure that he has managed fully to escape from it. Then if you look at late Bellow, in a sense his Jewish characters become mondial characters who are bemoaning the barbarians at the gates, so that they're identified with a kind of victim Western society in that way.
I mean, I think because it sort of links, I'm always interested, I think, in my fiction of treating almost disloyal characters as sympathetically as possible, and trying to find a value in something that we're used to seeing as immoral, so a kind of deep selfishness, a deep kind of appetitive egotism. And there's a kind of bit, I think Henderson actually, in Henderson the Rain King, the Bellow novel, his big cry is, I want, I want. And Roth actually says, you know, isn't it sad that marvellous cry of the id is actually a Gentile cry in Bellow's fiction? And then I think Roth is very brilliant at then kind of taking that I want and giving that to Jewish characters. And it sort of links to me, I think, in my head to this wider problem of how do you kind of render sympathetic people whose personal morality might be counter to a group morality, to the kind of accepted morality.
Yes, I think Roth is twisted around the proposition quite as much as Bellow ever was. I mean, if you look at the sort of great late Roth, you look at, I think, in particular, The Counterlife.
Yeah.
That is a very, very tortured novel about Jewish identity, it seems to me, in which he proposes Jewish identity in a way as a form of pathology. Yeah. I mean, as a kind of bipolar disorder in a way, and develops this counter-biography for himself in order to express that. Then if you look at the appetitive character in Sabbath's Theatre, he's deranged, he's almost psychotic. So I'm not sure that this is anything that Roth really managed managed to come to grips with. If you look at the character of Coleman Silk in The Human Stain...
Half-Jewish. Oh,
wholly Jewish. Pretending to, no, he's half Jewish, he's black, of course, that's the thing. And pretending, so what is going on with Coleman Silk? Incidentally, of the one I find to be, frankly, preposterous for all sorts of reasons. But what's going on with Coleman Silk is he burying his black identity in the way that some Jews bury their Jewish identity? Is that what the book's about? Or is it about something more insidious, which is what, of course, African Americans accuse the Jews of, which is being kind of turncoats to the question of ethnicity and ethnic rights, perhaps unjustifiably given the very honourable tradition of Jews helping the civil rights movement in the States. Yeah. So I'm not sure to get away from a lot of these questions and to create this character that we're in search of, kind of the self-hating Jew who doesn't hate him or herself for being Jewish.
I mean, it seems to me that because it's true that in Roth, almost the question of adultery and the question of being Jewish become the same thing for him. It's the similar, what it would be to be unfaithful on every level. And it's true that I think he never manages, he always has to slightly exaggerate. I love Roth, but I think one of the things I find lacking in him is that he's always forced into a kind of a pathology and into an exaggeration of a character, slightly to save the kind of moral problem, to actually get away from the real moral problem, which would be to create this kind of ideal character we're talking about. And it's as if still the superego is there, and the exaggeration is there to kind of as a sop to a wider morality that might be a bit less complicated than the one he's searching for.
Well, I think it's a flight from humanism. I think what Roth understands is that humanism is a very, very arid moral zone. You know, humanism is a philosophy in which God is dead and man is God. And I think Roth is repelled by that, but he doesn't want to reject humanism because he feels it will drive him back into Judeo-Christian morality. And that's the kind of tension that underlies a lot of his writing. Because I don't know what people here feel, and maybe when we open it up we can get some remarks, but for all Roth's warmth, his visceral quality, the kind of pulsion of his sexual writing, I feel that he's curiously desiccated and cold as a writer, oddly. Even a book like Sabbath's Theatre, which is full of sex, full of vigour, full of, a lust for the world, still seems slightly arid to me.
Well, I think one thing that is interesting, in terms of actually talking about writing, I've always felt that the interest of in the structures and the forms, but on a sentence level, his language is relatively desiccated. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's sort of bland almost. That it's not a very rich vocabulary. There's something quite kind of businesslike and brisk in the actual kind of in the sentences. And then just before this talk, we were talking about Kafka and how actually it seems that you were talking about the new Michael Hoffman translation, where the language is a lot more desiccated and kind of aridist. And this is something I was kind of thinking about, that I think both of us are interested in some kind of idea of style, and that a kind of, I certainly think that one of the things you look for in a great writer is a kind of total individuality in their kind of use of language. And this seems to relate to me, I think, to the kind of problem of belonging, because I think, back to Kafka maybe, he hates any idea of belonging to any larger group. As soon as that's kind of a proposition, his characters get kind of fixed. And I think one of the reasons Metamorphosis as a kind of problem is that he's always seeing these characters as kind of desperately trying to create themselves, but this actually just creates these kind of mutant forms that aren't fully kind of one thing or another.
But are you interested in the idea, do you think there's something specifically to be said about Jewish writers in relation to style? Because, I mean, is the adoption of a highly individualistic style an index or not of assimilation, and does it not relate to the question of what language you write in? So, you know, if you claim that Kafka's is a kind of anti, even though a German reader would always identify him as being a Czech German writer, what Hoffman says about Kafka's German is that it is intentionally linear, flat, unornamented. There's that quality in a good English translation of reading Kafka, where you have this sense that there is nothing literary about the language whatsoever. It's entirely matter of fact. Can we place at the other extreme Proust? And what is à la recherche du temps perdu but contorted, convoluted, highly stylized exercise in anxieties about Jewish assimilation, you know, taken almost to the nth and most parabolic possible degree.
I mean, I think
Yes, we're happy to discuss.
We can discuss.
You're very keen to discuss. Yeah, I think. Whoa! Hold on. You'll have your chance. All right. Lights up, please. Could you wait for a microphone? And could you be interested, but wait for a microphone, and then people will be able to hear you, because
there's one coming.
Your passion will be dissipated in the gloom and the lack of hearing. If we could have the lights up and a microphone for this very passionate lady here.
Can we tell you about Proust?
Yes, we didn't finish the Proust thought. Yeah. You're going to be shouted down by an audience who wish to hear about Proust. If we have the lights up so the lady doesn't feel that we're snubbing her, if you could sit down for a minute, we'll finish on Proust and then we'll come to you, okay? Is that all right? Yeah, but if you give us 2 or 3 minutes just to finish up on Proust, then we'll come to you.
And you were eating at the beginning, which was not polite.
I wasn't eating. It was drugs. Proust.
Got what I was going to say now. On the two things I was going to say with Proust are, there's an interesting book on Kafka by I've already gone off the point, by Deleuze, the French critic Deleuze, where he says that, and he uses Kafka as a case study of kind of what he thinks writers do to language, and he says they create a minor language within the major language, and so he says that what Kafka did. So I don't know actually how this relates to Hoffman's point, because according to Deleuze, in some way I think contradicts Hoffman, because Deleuze basically argues that Kafka creates this intensely Kafka language within German.
Yeah, I think the paradox of that Kafka language is, though, that it is a microcosm of a pre-existent dialogue, pre-existent dialect in that way. It's an ultimate crudescence of a certain kind of Czech German. But if you look at Proust, what is going on with Proust? He's creating there's no doubt he follows Deleuze in that way. He creates his own language within language.
Yeah. I mean, but then also I think, and this is almost where I think we go away from Judaism, because is Jewishness the real theme of à la recherche in that sense of the act? But there's also the fact that he was gay.
There's a sense in à la recherche that the Dreyfus case has rather crept up on sitting in his court-lined room, and suddenly he's become wholly. But in a way, all of à la recherche and what the Faubourg Saint-Germain represents to Marcel in the novel is assimilation, and what his love for Saint-Loup is about a love for a Gentile
But
character.
I suppose what I still want to say is that I think there's a question of desire in Proust, about who you're allowed to desire, how you're allowed to express this desire, what it means to want to kind of... Even the idea of a couple is a collective that is a kind of problem for Proust. And so I'm not sure. It seems to me that the Jewish... I don't know which is part of which, whether almost Jewishness is just one problem of a border among many others.
Well, it's certainly something seems to be going on around, the immediate pre-First World War period, around that period. It's interesting, you mentioned Weininger when we were discussing by email this topic, and Weininger, for people who aren't familiar with him, contemporary of Freud's, Jewish, homosexual, wrote
Sex and Character.
Sex and Character, in which he typed the Jew as inherently hermaphroditic and kind of embracing to both sexes, and that there was something kind of repulsive and tortured about this, and took his ideas to their own logical conclusion by killing himself.
By killing himself, yes.
But Weininger, almost forgotten now in a way that Freud, of course, isn't, was enormously influential on Proust and, of course, on Joyce, and one of the reasons why Joyce chose to make one of the protagonists of Jewish in that way. But for Joyce, he turned Weininger round. For Joyce, Bloom is a wholly admirable figure. Bloom is the coming man in every sense, precisely because he is able to celebrate his feminine characteristics.
I mean, actually, we've got a small amount of Weininger here. For those who are not familiar, as I'm sure you all are, with Weininger's great work, it is quite fun. Our present age, this is the penultimate chapter of his book, is called Judaism. It's just before the chapter called Women, which is women as well. Where he says, our present age shows Judaism at the highest peak it has climbed since the days of Herod. The spirit of modernity is Jewish wherever one looks at it. Our age is not only the most Jewish, but also the most effeminate of all ages. An age in which has derived the artistic urge in humans from the games played by animals, an age of the most credulous anarchism, an age without any appreciation of the state and law, an age of the shallowest of all imaginable interpretations of history, and
so on. And another person who was taken very hard by this was, of course, Wittgenstein,
who
was very upset by Weininger.
But it's true that Joyce takes all these kind of values that Weininger hates, which are kind of sex, kind of atheism, materialism, and for Joyce, these are fantastic things. For Weininger, these are bad.
Yes, you almost wish that Weininger could have read Ulysses, and maybe it would, would have been acted as a terrific therapy.
And he really would have killed himself.
Okay. Well, listen. Can we have the lights up now? Can we have the microphone for the front row? And let's allow her to kick this debate into a conflagration of some kind.